Well, hello again, everybody. I'm John, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. Today, a subject near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to you enjoying this. What are some examples of history being written by the victors? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Carthaginian civilization existed for well over 600 years. They controlled large parts of North Africa, Spain, Mediterranean islands, and had trade networks going all over the Mediterranean and even explored the African coast. They were powerful enough to bring Rome to the brink of defeat in two massive wars. Romans won, and as a result, not a single Carthaginian primary source exists. There's a bunch of Chinese history that is pretty much speculation, because whenever a new king would conquer places, pretty much the first move was always to burn all the records and kill the historians to establish dominance. After the Paraguay War, there were no losers left to write history. I guess Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina was what was left. The Kurzick Genocide. In 1916, when Kurzick families of the North, tired of oppression, refused to join Russia's army in World War I, Russian soldiers massacred around 30% of the population of the northern tribes. Now, they present it as an uprising, which happened because of German-Turkish spies. Anytime someone says, well, by the standards of time it was okay, when talking about an atrocity or horrific practice, it usually means by the standards of the people doing the atrocity. For example, slaves knew the slave trade was evil, but when we say people thought it was okay, we aren't counting the slaves as being people. The victims of history are voiceless, even if our sensibilities have evolved over time. We try to justify things by saying they couldn't have known, and almost always ignore a large group of people who certainly did know. The Philippines right now is an example of history being rewritten to ensure victory. I knew when I saw this thread, stuff like this would come up. I'm a Japanese person, and I would never defend any other horrific things Japan did in the past, but I'd like to defend the majority of our citizens who are sick and tired of the revisionist fascist government we currently are stuck with. I was so sick of I left. If you know anything about Japanese politics, you know that the current party doesn't have a serious contender party, and hasn't for a while. Racist boomers rally around the nothing bad ever happened party, while the rest of us can't rally around a credible threat. I was a teenager when I learned what our country really did, and it was horrifying. I wish I could do more than just post a Reddit comment. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say anymore. Surprised to see no one mention the massacres of Caesar during the Gallic Wars. He deliberately targeted certain Gallic tribes to make them cease to exist, which straight up is genocide. Almost every time I hear someone speak of the Gallic Wars, I see them either sidelining them to the civil war that followed it, or it is a heroic struggle from both sides. The Gauls are trying to remain free, while Rome is trying to expand and civilize. Almost every time I read about it, the atrocities are omitted, which I find to be really bad. During World War I, although Persia, now Iran, insisted that they didn't want to side with any country throughout the war, they still were invaded by Britain and Russia in November 1915. One of the first things that Britain did was to take over the grain storage of the country, resulting in multiplying the price of grains for the Persians. Not only that, the transportation of goods became difficult because the roads were in control of Russia. So, you can imagine how hard it became for the people to get their hands on grains, and soon after that, a massive famine happened across the country. The famine led to the outbreak of plague, typhus, etc. Long story short, still to this day, the total number of deaths remain to be uncertain, but some historians have suggested it's something between 2 to 3 million people in the span of 2 years. Some researchers have even made bold claims and presume the number is something between 8 to 10 million. Who knows? The victor didn't seem to bother about the situation. Source: The Great Famine and Genocide in Iran by Muhammad Ghali Majd. Harrowing stuff. One of my favorite parts of this job are learning about things that I didn't previously know, and I hadn't heard of this before, and I'll look it up, so thank you. The Philippine-American War. Because of World War II, the Americans were portrayed as heroes who had the Philippines' best interests at heart. but few people know about the genocide during the Philippine-American War that started in 1899. Almost 200,000 civilians dead, with civilians dying to disease, famine, and U.S. troops wiping out villages. Pretty much any indigenous population that got in the way of any colonial power. No single country has a monopoly on the violence and oppression that was done worldwide as the colonial powers expanded. All were guilty of it. Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Astor, Mellon, Morgan, Schwab, Stanford. They were called robber barons for a reason. All those schools and music halls and community centers are all built on the backs of crushed men and named after the men who crushed them. Germany being at fault for World War I, everyone was at fault during that period. Destruction of the natives in Canada, war crimes of Japan. Well, much of Roman history was written by the people who wanted to discredit whoever they succeeded. So, all these weird stories like, so-and-so was effing his mother and enjoyed kicking puppies, should be taken with a massive grain of salt, instead of being presented as, you'll never believe this crazy fact. Basically, when someone new came into power, they launched a retrospective negative publicity campaign against their predecessor. During World War II, the British firebombed German cities such as Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah, and Dresden, with the express purpose of killing civilians. Mass-scale firebombing is especially dangerous for civilians as it massively depletes the oxygen in a given area, causing many people to choke to death. Operation Gomorrah alone killed 37,000 civilians and injured another 180,000 over just 8 days. These firebombings were war crimes, but because the UK was on the winning side, no one was ever punished for it, and now it's never taught or mentioned here. I even remember my grandparents coming back from Cologne and commenting that they were disappointed there wasn't much of the old town to see, apparently unaware that that's because the British deliberately leveled the city. The Germans definitely do not forget it though, but they didn't win, so who cares, right? Notice that everything people are pointing out is well documented. People don't care is not the same as history being erased. It's a nonsensical thing to say. We have many records of people that lost conflicts. History is written by the literate is more apt statement. If history was only written by the victors, we would have zero historical context for Jews even existing. Robespierre, one of the main figures of French Revolution, has been killed by political opponents. They tried to delete his name from history, accused him of all the kills during the Terror, 3 years where a lot of people got killed because of a fear of a royalty return. They even used the body of a very ugly man to make people believe it was him. People still think it's him except historians, and basically now he's seen as a monster by some people. How Spain always claimed to have conquered the Americas by killing and fighting millions of Native Americans. They did not. Most died of sickness, but they played the badass army card for quite some decades. By today's standards, it would be embarrassing to tell about how good of a genocide job you did. In World War II, the American-British Bomber Command killed some 600,000 German civvies. The U.S. Bomber Command incurred something called area bombing in large civilian centers with firebombs, which they supplied to British Bomber Command. Many of the pilots were informed that they were bombing important railway, roads, military, industrial targets, and felt something wasn't right when bombing cities like Dresden. America didn't lose a single civilian to German bombers, and Britain lost 60,000. That's 1/10 the amount they killed in their combined bombing campaigns. MacArthur covering up the atrocities of Unit 731 so the US could get the results of their chemical and biological experiments on POWs and undesirables. Japan wanted it to fade away, and so did the US, and that is what happened. They were given immunity. No one paid for those crimes in the East. MacArthur forced all in the Pacific to sign NDAs before being released from duty. No one could talk about what happened in the Pacific. My mother's first husband was a POW in the Pacific. When he got back, he started saying what happened, and the authorities picked him up and took him away and would not tell her anything. They were Catholic, and she had to annul the marriage as the one thing they did tell her was he ain't coming back anytime soon. This is a terrible example of winners getting what they want. I mean, you could also look into Operation Paperclip and find an example from the German perspective of the American side. and how rocket technology developed from that. The Spanish conquering the Aztecs and Mayans. History, through the eyes of the Spanish, paint the Aztecs to be these horrific, dirty heathens that practice cannibalism. They also depict the Mayans to be the same way. However, over time, we have found out that although Aztecs did practice cannibalism and sacrifice their own people, they were also very clean people that practiced routine hygiene and even had a school system for their children. The Mayans had whole libraries that included untold amounts of mathematical knowledge. They were also master astronomers that discovered things about the universe that Europeans had no clue about for at least several hundred years. But the Spanish destroyed all of this and told the rest of the world nothing of these great things. Nobody cares about the massacres in Africa by Belgium and King Leopold. When I read the stories, it gave me absolute shivers. It is absolutely outrageous and incredible that there is few who are aware of such atrocities. The Croatian massacres towards Serbian population during World War II with the help of the Nazis. The Greek massacres in the south of Albania in 1940 to 46. How the British invaded India and systematically drained it of its resources and starving the people while carrying all the good over to mainland England. Winston Churchill was an F-twad who did this and was solely responsible for the vast majority of the deaths. That, and they burned historical books about the kings and kingdoms that existed before them and erased the mere mention of them. Pretty much anything about the pre-Columbian Americas. I mean, it's gotten a bit better in recent years, but most people still don't understand just how much was lost. Even today, Native Americans are often talked about as a singular culture of people who lived off the land and had no technology or cities. But in reality, there were as many cultures with as much variation between them as there are between Norway and Botswana. Europeans didn't just commit a genocide when they came to the Americas, they committed hundreds of genocides. While the civilized people of Western Europe were dumping their chamber pots out their windows onto the street and drinking beer because their water was too dirty, Mayans were using pressurized plumbing systems to distribute water and manage sewage. While Europeans were dying of horrible diseases from living off the contaminated meat, grain, and beer, numerous cultures of the Americas were using highly advanced agricultural practices like crop rotation, complex irrigation systems, civilization and cultivation, pest control, and many other techniques to give them rich, diverse cuisines. So many of the foods we take for granted today were carefully bred from inedible, often poisonous plants. Imagine Italian or Spanish food without tomatoes. Imagine modern American food without corn and beans. Imagine any Western culture's food without potatoes. Imagine a world without chocolate. All of those and many more were cultivated from the most inedible plants by people in the pre-Columbian Americas. I could go on. There are truly endless examples of agriculture, engineering, urban planning, architecture, art, and science in the pre-Columbian Americas that far surpassed their European counterparts. Europe decided to just go all in on military technology though, so as backwards as they were able to brute force their way through the Americas and beat the much more civilized cultures they encountered into submission and rewrite the story to make all those hundreds of cultures sound like one big group of dumb savages. I think it's harder to find examples in modern history because there are many cases where the victors control the narrative, but it's not so easy anymore to completely silence or erase alternative interpretations. Still, two American examples spring to mind where most people, non-historians at least, have it wrong. In the enslavement of Africans and the genocide of Native Americans, it's not the case that all those early Americans had a moral blind spot, but now we know better. Rather, those were contentious issues at the time, and many people opposed slavery and Native American genocide throughout America's history. For example, there were priests who opposed slavery on moral grounds from the start. Later, wherever there wasn't already an entrenched ruling class who relied on slavery for their wealth, Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, and other Christians, and others who believed in all men are created equal, fought hard and successfully managed to ban slavery early on, e.g. in Pennsylvania. Then, there was Andrew Jackson, clearly the Trump of his age, who ran on a popular platform of not honoring existing treaties with Native Americans, but instead killing and forcibly relocating them and stealing, conquering, their remaining lands for his voters. If it weren't for Jackson, the US would be smaller, but have less blood on its hands. And if it weren't for the efforts of anti-slavery activists who existed long before the Civil War, it would have far more. That there's no ban on communist symbols like there is on Nazi symbols. In Eastern Europe, you'll hardly find a familiar family that has not been touched by Soviet war crimes. My great-grandmother survived the Gulag and had to see the symbol of her oppressors every year on the 9th of May when Russian minorities very publicly and drunkenly celebrate their victory and were upset that natives didn't share the enthusiasm. The Ottoman Empire oppressed a lot of countries for over half a millennium, and during that time there was mass genocides, slavery that lasted until the 20th century, and torture. And not only that, but it also made them miss the evolution of the Renaissance, which still affects those countries to this day. There was a short period of time where the people of the oppressed countries were treated better, and that tends to be an excuse that the empire was not that bad, or even that the people who were under rule were cared for. Here's a more recent example. America rolled into Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan on false and/or baseless claims and waged long and brutal war simply to fulfill their own political ego, intentionally killing thousands or even millions of civilians in the process, even knowing full well that they wouldn't succeed in the long run. But the Americans kept it all hush-hush, and now it's just like, yeah, we did that, without acknowledging how terrible it was. And then Russia did the same exact thing with Ukraine. Now, Russia is seen as evil, sadistic, and huge threat to global peace, which they definitely are, but America has plenty of blood on its own hands. I'm sure there are a lot of examples where we could say, well, that country is just a pot calling the kettle black because they've all done horrible things, but hey, McDonald's. US forces committed mass rape in Europe and Japan during and after World War II. Though most people will point to Unit 731, comfort women, and the Holocaust, which they are 100% correct to point out were truly incomprehensibly evil, and brush over that one where the winners committed rampant, inexcusable war crimes as well, often against innocent people. Instances of rape in Europe alone may number up to 10,000, likely much lower. Pretty much anything involving slavery has been a watered-down version of what truly transpired. Some books actually detailed some of the horrific things slaves went through, but in most history books they tell you they got slaves to help the crops, take care of families, and some were treated as family and then they were freed. But that barely scratches the surface of the horrors people went through. US history. How many times have you heard the same story about George Washington, then skip ahead to the Civil War in a US history class? The US ignores and leaves out the process of the westward expansion, the Indian Wars, and treats the US as broken, the atrocities committed, and the graves of Native children in Catholic residential schools. One kid in my high school US history class thought the Native Americans were extinct. It breaks my heart to see the school system conveniently leave out unimportant details that just so happened to show when the US were the ones committing the atrocities: Wounded Knee, reservations, forced sterilizations. The giant propaganda war between the American Board of Health and the Pfizer and Bayer companies in the 1950s and 1960s regarding the difference between an immunization shot and a vaccine shot. Unfortunately, it has been erased from history books since the 90s, but I first learned about it in middle school history, 1998, and it gets harder and harder to find real information about it. Unfortunately, one of the few sources that haven't been suppressed by Big Pharma is a video by Dr. Tent about viruses and vaccines, but it has some other unrelated and off-the-wall stuff in it, so it's not the best source. One of these days I'll try and find a copy of my history books from middle school that had a chapter devoted to it. It was a huge lawsuit that went before the Supreme Court and was national news. It took place before and during the JFK administration. Before I get downvoted into oblivion, my children are vaccinated, and I'm not anti-vax, but it is important to learn how the vaccines and immunizations are made and pick the company that creates them using a less or non-harmful way. If anyone else reading this has more information on it or some better sources, I would appreciate it. I've had little luck finding evidence and records on the internet, although I do remember reading news articles about it when I was a kid and doing a test for the chapter in history class. How China massacred Tibet around the same time as the Vietnam War, and not many people seem to know about it, in my experience. Buddhists do not believe in using violence. These people couldn't even defend themselves. Just like how the Western world delves into developing technology, they developed their minds and did things that are almost miraculous. A lot of our findings in psychology also back up with some of their teachings that they've known for hundreds of years. We don't know how much information was lost because of that.